Okay, I think we're live. So it's just clicked over to 12. Might kick off. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, and so sorry, the next the next one. That's it. So yeah, so I thought I'd kick off with an acknowledgement of country. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many different lands from which we're joining the webinar today, and we'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, and also to emerging leaders. We also celebrate this ongoing culture and connection with the lands and the waters of this nation. And I'm joining the webinar today from Wurundjeri country. And I was actually recently reading something written by a Wurundjeri elder, which I think is pretty pertinent for the topic today. He said, for our mob, we see the land as our mother. Our elders have taught us that we were made from the earth, and she provides us with food, clothing, and shelter. And therefore we must treat her and all other people that depend on her with respect and care for the land and other peoples as we would our own family. Right, I thought that was a pretty simple statement, but very powerful in terms of, and I think it captures all of the essential elements that we now think of as sustainability when we talk about sustainability in business practices. So I thought that was a good place to start. And on that note, I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar on responsible sourcing. During the webinar today, we'll be presenting an overview of why we think responsible sourcing is, really not just important, but for us, it's a key pillar of our approach to the sustainability of our business. We'll present our responsible sourcing approach, excuse me, our commitment to ongoing responsible steel certification, and talk a little bit about responsible steel, and also how we can work together to manage ESG risks and uphold human rights across our shared supply chain. There's a particular focus in some parts of this webinar on trading businesses, as they play such a critical role in the steel industry supply chain. Traders connect buyers and producers. They provide financial and logistics solutions, and importantly, they play a significant role in managing risk in the supply chain. As upstream and downstream businesses embrace responsible sourcing and independent certification via industry schemes like Responsible Steel or the Responsible Minerals Initiative, there's great scope for this value add provided by traders to increase through the assessment and management of ESG risk and provision of verifiable chain of custody data. So I think that's one of the things that we're quite excited about with this shift in responsible sourcing, and the focus both downstream and upstream on those aspects of the supply chain. So welcome. I hope you enjoy the webinar. Over the last week at BlueScope, we've been holding a number of events around some key human rights observation days. The 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, International Day of People with a Disability, and of course, Human Rights Day at the end of this week. And this is one of those events, and the themes in today's webinar are sort of unashamedly focused on human rights issues. And with that, I'll hand over to Tracy for the next couple of sections. Sorry.
Hi, thanks very much, Andrew. I just had to work off my mute as normal. Thanks everyone for joining us. So I'm briefly going to touch on why responsible sourcing is important, both to BlueScope, but to everybody in our supply chain. As you know, we live in a really complex, interdependent world, as was really shown over the last few years during the pandemic. And our shared supply chains reach across hundreds of countries and touch lives of millions of people around the world. So anyone in Australia will know the impact of on the environment and climate change of the world that we live in, the floods, the heat waves, the bushfires over the last few years, and that's global. And it is really leading to a large number of climate change refugees. Those refugees are then, trying to get to places where there is less impact and more infrastructure. So to Europe, etc. They are becoming victims of human trafficking. They're vulnerable and they end up in supply chains. Inequality globally also exacerbated during COVID between the countries that were able to support people who were not able to work and countries who weren't, countries that had better health systems. Child labour, the horrible fact is that there are definitely child labourers within our supply chain. And the issue has gotten worse, particularly in countries like India, where children weren't able to go to school during COVID and they didn't have the luxury of Wi-Fi and internet and tablets, etc., to continue their education. And unfortunately, in some of these families, if children aren't at school, they're not getting state meals that are often provided at schools. They need to find work to help support their family and put food on the table. Obviously, modern slavery and human trafficking is a problem, particularly in the minerals extraction. There is a lot of modern slavery in Central Africa, etc. Terrorism financing, that's also quite related to Nigeria and the DRC, where artisanal mines are run by terrorist-run groups. The metals are extracted and then kind of greenwashed as they move through the process, and we will buy them thinking we're buying from a certified mine, but along the way those products have gotten into our supply chain, and of course they are supporting terrorism financing, and then obviously global conflict. So we all felt the pressure of the Russia and Ukraine conflict, and having to try and change our supplies, ensure that we are sourcing from countries not supporting global conflicts. I also wanted to touch on modern slavery. As Andrew said, this week there are a number of events that we are focusing on: the abolition of slavery and Human Rights Day. And obviously, one of the main focuses on our responsible sourcing program is on eliminating forced labour and modern slavery. For those of you who aren't aware, recently the global estimates of modern slavery was published. The figure is from last year, but it is estimated that there are 49.6 million people living in modern slavery in the world today, and that is almost double Australia's population. So if you think of it in that terms, it's an enormous problem, and the problem is global. It's no country is immune to it. It could be down your street, it could be in a local restaurant, etc. The stat of Australia having 15,000 victims of modern slavery is very old. I think it's from 2016. There will be a new estimate next year. But we know that that is much higher. Recently, the AFP came out and said that in the last financial year, they had 294 reports of human trafficking or modern slavery in Australia. And if you consider that, it's a very small percent that is reported, because a lot of this goes undetected. So the number must be much bigger. So the 6 forms of modern slavery: human trafficking, we all understand that one. Quite a few years ago, those poor Vietnamese victims died in the truck going to the UK. More recently, there was the issue in Texas, where I think 40 plus people from Central America died in a truck because it was so hot. It's a global problem. And, even with the conflict in Ukraine, very quickly, human traffickers set up kind of shop at the borders of the Ukraine, offering refugees jobs, saying that they will take them to a different country and provide them with support, and really they were trafficked and forced into modern slavery. Debt bondage, where people pay off, are kind of given a loan to be given a job, and they pay it off at an exorbitant interest rates. Actually, many of them don't know that how much their debt is. And although, you know, there are cases, for instance, in India where people are still paying off the debts of their grandparents, it's quite prevalent in countries where there might be migrant labor. So in Asia, Nepalese might pay to get a job in Malaysia or Thailand, and then they're stuck into debt bondage. Forced marriage doesn't really impact our supply chain, but there is a high number of forced marriages in Australia and in other countries. It is a focus area of a lot of governments to try and stop that. People as young as 10 being taken and forced into marriage, and that is basically slavery for the rest of their lives. Slavery and slavery-like practices where people are locked up. Often I've heard stories of people being brought into the country and locked up to clean in factories and never being let out and being threatened. Forced labour, some of that is government endorsed, but often it's using coercion, fear, people on visas, a lot in the agriculture sector, and forcing people to work for little or no pay. And obviously the worst forms of child labour. Unfortunately, we work in an industry where a lot of our products and the goods within the industry are high risk. So metals extraction, pig iron and biochar, construction services and materials, textiles and PPE, batteries, technology, shipping. I always think it's the sort of forgotten area of the supply chain. Often we put a lot of focus on ensuring that the goods that we buy are responsibly sourced, but we forget about how they get from one place to another. Chemicals, heavy machinery, and solar panels. So I will then quickly move on to BlueScope's responsible sourcing commitment and approach. Obviously, we are committed to sustainable supply chain practices, as I hope you all know, and looking to create and protect long-term environmental, social, and economic value for all stakeholders involved in bringing BlueScope products and services. So the stakeholders include the people who work for BlueScope, our shareholders, anyone within our supply chain, their family members, plus the communities within which we and our suppliers work. We have a commitment to our customers, our people, and our shareholders, and local communities, but we also have legislative obligations. Being headquartered in Australia, we report under the Australian Modern Slavery Act, and currently there's a threshold of 100 companies with an annual consolidated turnover of $100 million need to report, but it's likely it will be lowered, and all the submissions to the government that I have read have recommended it is lowered to 50 million. So for many of our suppliers, if you're not reporting at the moment, you may need to be reporting within the next couple of financial years. The New Zealand Modern Slavery Act is likely to be implemented in the coming year, and it'll have a much lower threshold than Australia. I think that's about 20 million, but there'll be different tiers across sort of what reporting requirements. And then there is a specific US and EU legislation. Obviously, California was a leader in the modern slavery legislation. The EU is really targeting all legislation around corporate social responsibility and ESG, and increasing legislation globally around human rights, climate change, obviously the link between climate change and human rights, and biodiversity, etc. So we have a responsible sourcing framework that we've established, had established for quite a few years, and we keep enhancing. Our policies, our purpose and our bond drive our commitments and our values. We also have an inclusion and diversity policy, our human rights statement, which is available online, our health, safety, environment and community policy, our Speak Up policy, which is very important. It's anonymous. It allows people within our supply chain or any stakeholders to raise concerns that they might have about us or any of our suppliers. Our supplier code of conduct, which I hope you've all seen and read. We are in the process of amending it in line with global change on legislation plus expectations on responsible sourcing and corporate social responsibility. We have a new responsible sourcing policy, which we can share with you after this webinar. And we have a new responsible sourcing framework, which we hope will make it easier for suppliers to understand what we do and what they need to do. Within our responsible sourcing approach, we focus on business ethics, labour and human rights, health and safety, environment and community. With regards to our assessment and engagement approach, we have a format or a process where we prioritise suppliers. So we look at high-risk suppliers based on where products are coming from, but also what the product is. And we work with our teams globally to understand their risks or their view of risk as well. We engage internally and externally to explain why responsible sourcing is important, so having forums like this, and to describe ESG risks across our value chain, and we collaborate with industry partners. So Andrew will give you a bit of an update on responsible steel, but we also work with the UN Global Compact Network, World Steel, Be Slavery Free, etc. We have a formal assessment framework with independent assessments. So we've got supplier adverse media and sanction checks we do. We use EcoVadis assessments and third-party online assessments, on-site assessments and industry certification schemes, which we do accept from suppliers. And then we work with suppliers to improve any identified areas, but we also work on our own improvement. And our procurement teams include responsible and sustainable business practices as key criteria in sourcing processes, conduct initial risk assessments and required due diligence on suppliers, and engage with suppliers on our supplier code of conduct and make responsible sourcing a standing agenda item in meetings. If they aren't, I hope that you will add that to your agenda item for our meetings and collaborate with suppliers on responsible sourcing and continuous improvement. What we expect of our suppliers is that they should commit to our supplier code of conduct. They should develop and implement a responsible sourcing program of your own and increase awareness and manage risks within our shared supply chain. Implement a grievance mechanism, preferably anonymous, and also share BlueScope's Speak Up details with the relevant team members in your business. Provide information as required and complete assessments and take corrective action plans where responsible sourcing and business risks are identified. And obviously focus on continuous improvement. So I kind of sped through that, but we have a lot to cover, so I didn't want to take too long. Rhiannon, can you switch to Andrew, please? Oh, you have.
Thanks, Tracy. So Tracy, what Tracy went through there was our current approach to responsible sourcing, and one that we've built up over the last 5 years that we've been working on it. What I wanted to touch on now is a bit, just to give you a bit more information about responsible steel. So Responsible Steel, BlueScope are a founding member of Responsible Steel, and Responsible Steel is now a sort of quite a large industry organisation. It's the steel industry's first global multi-stakeholder standard and certification program, and essentially it's an entity that creates standards that define the characteristics of responsible production, sourcing, and production of steel, and then have a certification program to certify steelmaking businesses or sites against that standard. Responsible Steel its membership but includes steelmakers. But it also includes many customers of the steel industry and also civil society members. And whenever they produce a new standard, there's an approval process that requires a majority of support from both civil society and industry members of Responsible Steel. So it's quite a rigorous standard creation process. Excuse me, sorry. The first version of the standard came out several years ago and then has subsequently been updated with stronger requirements for greenhouse gas emissions and responsible sourcing. And version 2 of the standard was actually approved and released this year, around the middle of the year. The standard defines, as I said earlier, defines the fundamental elements that characterise responsible sourcing and production of steel, and really sets a benchmark for steel companies. It's a pretty tough ask for steel companies and our supply chains to get certified. To achieve responsible steel certification, it requires the production sites to undergo a rigorous third-party audit with an independent certification committee. But once that certification is achieved, it gives some assurance to customers and other stakeholders that appropriate environmental and social sustainability protocols are being followed. Our BlueScope's Port Kembla site achieved certification, and what we're now reviewing is when we basically renew that certification against the new and updated standard. So that will come fairly soon. Next slide, thanks, Tracy. Yeah, so the standard aims to ensure that businesses and consumers can be confident that the steel they use has been sourced and produced responsibly. It has focus areas on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, responsible sourcing practices, and responsible business practices, and responsibly sourced raw materials and services. Next slide, thanks. The standard's built around 13 principles, but for the session today, I'll just focus on 3 of these, principles 3, 6, and 7. So principle 3 covers the requirements for responsible sourcing, and it requires steel companies to increasingly source input materials from suppliers that are working to improve their ESG performance and address their ESG risks. So there's a very sort of solid requirement there for us to be engaging with our input material suppliers, whether we buy directly or through indirect channels, and encouraging them to be on a path of seeking industry certification against an approved, typically mining industry certification scheme, and there are a number of those that exist. It requires us to commit to responsible sourcing and incorporate it into key functions and processes of our business. It requires us to establish a chain of custody in upstream supply chains for input materials that come from responsible sources. So that the chain of custody requirement is critical to ensuring that you can prove that that so much of your iron ore, coking coal, limestone, whatever it is, comes from the supplier that you say it's coming from, and that their sustainability credentials through the supply chain. It requires us to strengthen and account for our responsible sourcing, so that's around our internal processes and engagement with suppliers and our, I guess, mass balance accounting processes. And it requires us to report publicly on responsible sourcing. So it's quite a big step up in terms of the requirements, and we'll progressively be engaging with suppliers at to our sites that are seeking responsible steel certification around those increased requirements. Principle 6 focuses on labour rights, and not surprisingly, respecting the rights of workers in our supply chain and the rights of workers to fair, safe contractual employment with their employers. And this also applies to not just workers on our own sites, our contractors, but also workers in our supply chain. And then Principle 7 focuses on human rights, which requires businesses to not cause any adverse human rights impacts through their activities and to address any impacts where they do occur. And again, this applies to our own operations and our supply chains. So that, as you saw with the 13 principles, there's a lot more to the full standard, and the assessment process that we've already been through to be certified against the initial standard is very rigorous. But we'll be working our way towards certification against the version 2 standard over a yet to be determined time frame, but we'll certainly start working towards that in the very near future. So that's a bit of an overview of the responsible steel standard. I'll hand back to Tracy.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm quickly going to move on to our trading partners. As Andrew said at the very beginning, it's a really important relationship to us. It helps us connect our supply chain and buyers and producers, and providing financial and logistics solutions and managing risk. As an upstream and downstream businesses embrace responsible sourcing and independent certification via industry streams, there's a great opportunity for traders to provide additional value to increase through assessment and management of ESG risks and provision of chain of custody data. As Andrew mentioned, this is becoming a bigger focus area for us and other businesses like our own because of responsible steel requirements, global pressure, investor pressure, etc. So I'll just quickly move on. Many of you might have been asked to complete an assessment by BlueScope, either a the self-assessment questionnaire, or via EcoVadis, and thank you if you did complete it. I just want to go through a summary of the EcoVadis assessment score and finding for our trading partners. Unfortunately, trading partners have scored quite low historically. So you'll see a summary from EcoVadis that the average overall score has been 40.7. We sort of take it as a pass mark. I don't like to use the word pass mark of being 45 and above. So in some areas they score well, labour, and that is primarily because their direct labour works in offices around Australia or New Zealand, but not very strong sustainable procurement controls, and some have even scored fairly low at 11%, 15 to 24. As a summary, 78% of the traders that we have assessed through EcoVadis have no evidence of supplier corporate social responsibility. risk analysis and/or supplier corporate social responsibility assessments. Positively, 67% do have policies on corruption, which would be expected for traders. Unfortunately, only 33% have active whistleblowing procedures in place, which is actually one of the principles within the United Nations Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights. Only 11% audit or assess their own suppliers on corporate social responsibility issues, and only 11% have policies on sustainable procurement issues. And very few have supplier code of conduct, unfortunately. It was so low it didn't register in the reporting. So the question is what can trading partners do? What commitments can they make on ESG and responsible sourcing, which will help us? We're really looking for our partners to develop a public human rights policy and a responsible sourcing policy, which then should become a focus for the business. Develop a supplier code of conduct, which requires suppliers to meet responsible sourcing business standards. Implement an anonymous grievance mechanism, which can be shared with suppliers and on your public website. Include ESG and responsible sourcing clauses in all contracts with suppliers and in your terms and conditions. Implement an assessment program and regularly assess supplier ESG risks based on source country, product, source region and product, etc., and focus on internal and supplier awareness and training on responsible sourcing and ESG risks. And work with BlueScope to get visibility on the complex layers of our shared supply chain. As Andrew stated, this will become more of a focus area in responsible steel, but also under our Modern Slavery Act legislative requirements. We will be looking to understand the tiers of our supply chain more deeply. So particularly tier 1, tier 3, etc., tier 2 and tier 3, etc. And I would just conclude in saying that responsible sourcing is a journey, and I think many companies have put it off because it is quite hard. But we encourage all our trading partners and all our suppliers to make a start. You can do that by reading the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, referring to the Sustainable Development Goals, and also reading the United Nations Global Compact Network's 10 principles, which also give direction. And finally, take a continuous improvement approach, which is what we're doing as well. So we sped through our presentation. We thought it would be much longer. There haven't been any questions yet. If you do have any questions, can you quickly type them into the questions and answer option? It would appear not. Andrew, do you have any final comments?
Thanks, Tracy. Look, I think, I mean, if you do, we've sped through a fair bit, I think, in the materials here. If you do have any questions about, how we're approaching responsible sourcing, or if you want to get your hands on any of the materials that Tracy mentioned at the start, our new framework document, we'll be certain to kind of do some push publication of our new supplier code of conduct once that's approved, and also our responsible sourcing policy. So very happy to share all of those with you. If you have any questions, that this has sparked, and you want to talk with us about them, then Tracy and I are both available for questions, but also your normal contact at BlueScope would be able to help you out with any questions. I do think this is, there's a real opportunity here for players in the supply chain to differentiate themselves, both with participating in assessment processes, but also with helping businesses to manage risk in the supply chain, be it their own, through their own operations or through businesses that they buy from, whether you're a trader or you're buying and transforming products yourself. So I think that's a really big opportunity for differentiation. So I've got a question here from Wes. Will you circulate some information to follow up that we can share with our CSR team overseas? So certainly our framework is up and running. Tracy, were we sharing the pack from the webinar?
Yes, we will. After this, we will share the pack. Plus, I'll share our responsible sourcing policy and
the framework.
And our framework. It is worth noting at the moment the policy is not live on our BlueScope website because we're just rewriting some of the words, etc. But it will be up hopefully early in the new year as well.
I think that's my fault. We're not rewriting the words of the policy. We're rewriting some of the words on the website.
On the website, yes. Yeah.
And then another question: who are the best contacts for working with BSL for ESG-related issues? It depends a bit on the issue, but certainly your normal kind of contracting partner at BlueScope is a good starting point. But again, Tracy and I are also available to reach out and talk to, but it might vary depending on if it's more environmentally focused or more sort of human rights and supply chain focused.
Yeah.
Good question.
Andrew, there's a question from Robert. As a modestly sized Australian-owned trading company, is there support that BSL can provide to design ESG policies such as templates? I'd actually recommend that you go to the Walk Free Foundation site, and they actually have a toolkit or toolbox, I think it's called. I looked at it the other day. I will share that link as well to all attendees, and it is very comprehensive, and it does include how to develop things. But also a great place to start is if you have been assessed by EcoVadis, they actually have a reference material, I think it's called, or documents, and they actually provide quite detailed information on different documents as well. But I will share links, definitely share links. I know it can be hard, and I think people don't know where to start, so they kind of put it off. But once you start, you see the benefit, and definitely then you want to do more, which is exactly what BlueScope did, because you see the positive difference being made. Yeah.
It's a really good question because I mean there's actually a lot of material out there, and it's kind of difficult to filter out. Where do I start? But Walk Free are an excellent place to start. But yes, we can if you have any sort of further questions about that, we can sort of point you in to some other good resources as well.
I attended a great webinar a few days ago, and the same question was asked, and somebody was like, well, can I copy your policy? And it's like, no, well, you can't copy a company's policy, but you can read them and kind of use them as a guide to create your own as well. And I will also share the link of the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights, because it is the foundation document of all the ESG and CSR work over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And it's it goes and quite easily breaks down things companies should have as a foundation. It doesn't look like, oh, EcoVadis survey. If you have not received a survey, are we likely to see something?
So the EcoVadis, our approach to the EcoVadis assessments is sort of somewhat is risk based, and we do kind of try and do an initial assessment of risk based on the kind of the supply chain that we're looking at, where the supply chain predominantly operates, but also the kind of industry and what that sort of tells us about the upstream supply chain. If you haven't been asked to do an EcoVadis survey yet, it doesn't mean you won't be. I mean, as we sort of review that prioritization, we're always kind of refreshing, who our sort of higher priorities for those sorts of assessments are. So that might come up. If you would like to do one, certainly welcome that, and just reach out to us or your procurement contact, and we can set that up.
Yeah, I think it's also worth adding that we've seen a significant uptick of companies like ourselves joining EcoVadis and asking their suppliers to be assessed. So if we haven't asked you, it doesn't mean another one of your clients isn't going to ask you in the short term. And we've seen companies that are proactive and join themselves actually reaping the benefits of it, because it identifies areas that you might need to focus on. And then companies are proactively being reassessed so they can get their score up. So recently we had quite a big supplier that many of you might be supplying